2. Come on, here we go. Hello, welcome to episode 2 of Politics and Plastic. My name is Jim, and I am muted. Hello, that is still muted. I'm not muted. I think I'm live. So hello, everyone. My name is Jim. Welcome to episode 2 of Politics and Plastic. Let's make sure that I have sound because I'm a dum-dum. I don't know how my technology works. Yep, we got sound. All right, perfect. I'm joined today by Peter Colissimo.
I'll take it all. It's fine.
People also known as the Falcon.
Yep.
And why do people call you the Falcon?
10 years ago, I made a bet with a guy that I could give myself my own nickname and changed my Facebook name to Falcon as my middle name. And 10 years later, people didn't know that was a bet and started calling me that. And here we are. So it worked. I played the long game and won.
Okay. And I just want to make sure that I'm not muted because sometimes I feel like I don't know how the audio works. Okay. So if anyone in chat who is slightly smarter than me and...
There are people watching us? Oh my God.
Now yeah, there's definitely people watching us. It sounds like I'm working. Okay. All right. So, all right, guys. So today we're going to talk about comp scores and what they are and whether they should make a return. Before I get into that, I just have a few quick announcements. So the first announcement is that I have added a single TTS game to the stream schedule this week. So on Thursday night after the Best Overall show, I'll be streaming a game in a TTS pod that I'm playing at 8 o'clock versus Drukhari. So Death Guard Terminus S versus New Drukhari. So if you guys are interested in that, check that out. Second of all, if you guys are enjoying the podcast, please make sure to like and subscribe to me on YouTube and Twitch. I'm trying to get up to 1,000 followers/subscribers, which sounds crazy, but I'm already at 234, which is not bad for 3.5 weeks. And then third, if you guys are interested in listening to this show on podcast format, it is available on the Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Play, Podbean. I don't know, any of them. Just search the Best Overall Show. That's the banner name for the various shows that I do here. So, and that's just the audio component as well. So if you're interested in that. So, well, Peter, before we get into it, how the hell are you? I haven't seen you. I think BAO is probably, or maybe LVO was last time I saw you.
We saw each other, a year and a half ago almost now. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been doing great. Well, as great as you can given everything that's going on. How about you, bud?
I'm okay. I'm also doing as great as one can do given the circumstances. It was funny. I was talking to someone about BAO, I think, and I was like, wow, that was like almost 2 years ago. Like it's coming up on 2 years on like some of like the 2019 season. Like we're starting to hit anniversaries and stuff, and it's just like, I don't know. It's a really weird feeling to know that this has been going on for almost 2 years.
It sucks. It really sucks.
Yeah.
But we're almost out. I think we're almost out. But yeah, 2 years in a row, I have booked off BAO and then not been able to go. It's a little disappointing to me, but yes, such is life, man.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm still the Adepticon champ, so I'm happy about that.
Reigning Adepticon champ, second place at BAO after going undefeated for 8 rounds.
The longest running Adepticon champ in history, 3 years running. So I'll take that. I'll take that.
Default.
The accolade, I guess.
It's the best
all right. So yeah. So getting to our main topic. And just for you guys, I promised last week that I wouldn't bury next week's episode under like at the very end. So I'm just gonna tell you guys what's happening next week on Politics and Plastic. So next week we have Val Heffelfinger on. Who is just a random dude that I found on the streets. We're going to be talking about 40K as an esport, not just whether it could be, but whether it should be, because I think that's the bigger question.
I agree.
That's going to be next week, and that should be at 7 o'clock as well. So kind of stay tuned for that. And then again, this Thursday on the Best Overall show, we also have Daniel Smith, who's the co-founder of Brohammer. He's like the lesser well-known Brohammer guy. I think mostly people remember Siegler and John Lennon. They're kind of like the famous Brohammer dudes. But Daniel Smith is the real heart and soul of that team. So we're going to have him on Thursday, and I'm excited to talk to him. David Koska, who's my co-host, he's been off in the desert painting models like in the mountains. So
his brushes.
I've seen his Instagram. Yeah, I've never seen someone. The guy literally will go paint in the forest with like a single pot of paint and a brush. So anyways, getting to our main topic. So this is a topic that I think actually has a lot of, I guess, a bit more salience right now, Peter, because obviously with where the edition is, and I guess the first question I wanted to start with you is, obviously you're the stats center guy. You're the kind of the brain of many things happening in 40K. Where do you think the game is at, I guess, today from a balance perspective, given the kind of current landscape of books? Like, do you feel like, based on what you're seeing, obviously, and I know Drakari obviously had a pretty stellar weekend from the sounds of it, but where do you kind of see the overall state of balance in the game?
I would have I want to give Drakari like another week or so to simmer, because I think like knee jerk is like they have changed things a little too much. But pre Drakari, the game is a lot more balanced than I think a lot of people think it is. I've not only been tracking, like I normally just track GTs and majors, and not a lot of them because of COVID, but Australia's been going strong, so it's still putting out 1 or 2 a week. So like we do have data for that, but I've also been looking at practice games along with the guys at Goonhammer. RTTs I'll pull from a BCP and down under pairings as well, just to get a feel for how it's playing across the board. And I would say the game is in one of the most, up until this Drakari release at least, in one of the most balanced states it's been in a long time. There are definitely issues. There are certain armies that are probably slightly better than others, but I think that the general consensus may be a little off. Like there are certain people that are like, well, this army is super broken, or X army is super broken, and we're not really seeing that. There are definitely some have armies. There's 5 or 6 armies that are, like a level above, and there's probably 4 or so armies that need help. But like the general mix is very strong. If you go on 40kstats.com, you look at like the T-Whip scores and armies that have been undefeated in the last 2 months. It's really broad. Like I want to say it's something like 16 or 18 different armies have either won an event or gone undefeated at an event, just in the last couple of months. And that's huge. That's not something we've seen probably since pre the Space Marine Second Codex, when that kind of blew everything to smithereens for a while. So,
right. And actually, you bring up Drakari, and that's a good point. And there is actually kind of like a side topic that I maybe want to kind of get into a little bit. Obviously, it's not the main topic, but do you think that 40K should adopt? And I know the release of FAQs, the first FAQs, is a little bit slower than it normally does, but I know it's fairly common in most AOS tournaments to actually outlaw army books until the first FAQ drops. Do you think that's something that we should be looking at in 40K as well? Because it seems to me, and we haven't really had a ton of, I guess, in issues in the, like, if you look at the previous books that have been out so far for 9th, we haven't had a ton of like things where you're like, well, this is obviously not good or obviously broken. I think with Dark Eldar, we're definitely seeing a few of those combos where you kind of scratch your head and are like, well, was this really intended? And I know obviously if you look at the Death Guard FAQ, that actually had made a huge impact on the power level of the book. So do you think that's something that maybe not like, it's not, I'm sure we could have a whole discussion topic on it, but do you think that's something that 40K should look at, or at least, kind of take the way that the speed at which we adopt books and events with a bit more of a grain of salt? Or is that something that you think we should just kind of, march forward regardless of things that seem obviously broken?
I personally think, it's really difficult. I would, because there's 2 really strong arguments for this. One is you want to have a balanced event, and when you get something like Drakari with the Trip to Twit, where you're like, this is probably not what anybody wanted, a unit with up to 42 attacks. Like you really want to be like, we should broadly do this. Going back, I know most of Sweden, for example, immediately kind of today, we're not using new books until a FAQ because of Iron Hands. And like since then, that's kind of been their shtick. I think that there's still a need to have events with the broken stuff in it to make sure it actually is broken, right? So I would say if you're considering yourself like a major or super major status event, this might be the time to be like, yes, we need to implement a and I know that it's been brought up to FLG recently because they were asking a similar question, to do you can allow anything as long as there's been at least one FAQ, because I do think that is necessary, but we also should wait and see if it's actually a problem. I know like when the Space Marine 9th edition Codex came out, everybody was really into Apothecary plus the stupid buggies and how strong a combo that was, where you can res an 8-wound model, right? And they did FAQ it in existence for like 2 months, and I think the best it ever got was one guy got like second place at an event with it, and he lost his first game. So it was like he submarined his way into that. So it wasn't something that was overly strong, at least competitively. It was something that hurt lower end tables, which is, well, like, it's not, I don't think we should only ever balance to the top end of the game. We do need to consider the maybe not more like casual, but like semi-competitive environment as well, where you're going to go into a game and there's just certain combos you have no answer to, but like a strong player doesn't care about. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I actually do agree with you, because I think sometimes players might look at something on paper and it seems a lot stronger than it actually is. And so you end up in this situation where there's a bit of a kind of gut reaction right away that, hey, this is too strong, needs to get nerfed. And then it ends up not being strong. Or the opposite, we might see something like, a really good example is the Tallyman rule in Death Guard.
Mm-hmm.
I think almost everyone ubiquitously thought that would get FAQ'd.
Yep.
And they didn't touch it. So sometimes you might end up doing the opposite, where you end up waiting for something to get fixed and it just never does. Yep. And then you're like, oh, well, actually it was intended. So I actually do agree with you that I don't really like that rule. Now, I actually do want to touch on AOS a little bit, because it is a bit of a parallel game system in a lot of ways. And I think when we kind of get into the discussion on comp, it's actually a really good, it's probably like an environment that maybe comp is a bit more appropriate, right? Like, I think in a lot of ways, I guess what I'm saying is we're seeing a lot more player imposed comp in AOS, and I want to dig into a little bit of why we're seeing that. So that's an interesting question. So just going into, for those of you that have never played or don't know what the word comp means, or it stands for composition, and generally and I'll give you kind of my impression, and I'd love to hear kind of your angle on it and what you kind of think is comp. But since I started playing Games Workshop games, so I think 3rd edition 40k and I want to say 5th edition fantasy, generally in tournament play there was always some additional rules imposed by either the players or the TOs to help keep the game a little bit more level. And generally, I think that the game, just like as you mentioned, is in a much better place of balance, but that wasn't always the case. And I think if you look at the history of the various editions of the game, so whether it's Fantasy 5th edition, we used to call Fantasy 5th edition Hero Hammer. That was literally what we called it, because you just take 1 or 2 heroes, you load them up with magic items, and they would just go in and, like, I used to have a Chaos Lord that did 14 d6 attacks with his Hydra Blade and Potion of Strength, flying on a double-headed Chaos Emperor Dragon. Like, it was just like, and he was like, it was just ridiculous, right? So comp for me has always been, player imposed rules to either encourage more balanced armies or to punish, and so that encouragement is either through like kind of a carrot or the stick approach, right? So the two kinds of comp systems that I'm most familiar with are basically a scored comp system, which is a little bit more objective. So a really good example is the Swedish comp system. Swedish comp system was a comp system that existed, I think I want to say 7th and 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy, and basically it was a system created. I like you said that the Swedes were also I feel like the Swedes, I don't know if maybe because they're like pacifists, but it seems like they're always adopting these like balancing measures. They're like the very like neutral party, always
it's
taking on.
They're cutthroat. It's 100%.
Yeah.
Like something I've mentioned on 40k Stat Center. Like if you want to know what's strong in a meta, like go watch like a Westeros tournament result games, like because they like if Gene Stealer cults are good, 30 of the 40 guys that show up to an event will play Gene Stealer cults and be like, what? How? Like why? Nobody else in the world is running Gene Stealer cults right now, but they'll have orders or dudes are playing it. It's generally like and I think that's why like they're just such arseholes when it comes to competition that they need to apply it to themselves more than anything. That's my jokey reason, I think. But yeah, like they've long been like these stewards of different comp systems.
Yeah, and I want to differentiate, and I think, as I was saying earlier, comp kind of in 2 different types. There's hard comp, which would be like very strict rules, like, hey, you can't take this, you can't take that, or actual changes to the rules of the game. whether it's in what you're allowed in your army. So it actually changes the way that you build your army. And then soft comp, which I generally will, generally in my eyes, is something where you can just take whatever you want, but then the player that you play essentially might give you a score, or the judge might give you a score to essentially say, hey, yeah, you can take whatever you want, but we might penalize you in some way, whether either the player that you're playing doesn't give you, maybe it's each time you play this, your opponent would give you a score out of 10. And if it's a 10, that means you took a really thematic army, took a really fun army. And if it's a 1, it means you took just like a broken hard as nails list with no thought to theme. Corn and Slanesh, which I used to run in Warhammer Fantasy, just because it was great. And so those are kind of in my mind the two kind of types of comp systems, and I definitely want to talk about either of them and the merits of both down the road. But what's in your eyes, kind of what is a comp system? Why do they exist, and what is your kind of history with them, or what do you know about them?
Well, I started playing Warhammer style games in mid to late 6th edition fantasy, and then late 4th, early 5th 40k, I want to say. So about 12, 13 years. I've been at it maybe a little longer. And I did play comp fantasy occasionally. We were pretty hardcore little club back on the east coast of Canada, and fantasy was our game of choice. And we would generally we would eschew it. We would use it more as what's actually broken right now more than anything else. We would look at Swedish tournament comp lists and be like, oh wow, they think that's bad. Well, what if we did this? And that was kind of we would more twink the system than anything else if we even bothered with it. Twinking meaning to still try to break it as much as possible, despite putting these kind of restrictions on a list. But I what your definitions are spot on to how I've always viewed them. With the exception as I've gotten older, I've kind of put comp into any modification to the gaming, the core gaming system, right? We kind of talked a little pre-show, ITC, while it would nobody that played ITC in 6th and 7th edition Warhammer 40k would have called it a comp system. To me, it was, because they applied extensive FAQs to the game to make it, in their opinion, more playable, right? So there'd be certain abilities that they'd be invisibility is way too strong, so we're going to make it so you have to do this to use it. That is comping the game. It might not be like you say, a soft comp where you're saying, well, this army's not fluffy enough or what have you. But it's still changing the way the game is played. It's changing the army composition that a player is going to take to function, right? If you went to the UK and played a 7th edition 40k game, they generally didn't use ITC rules, and often they didn't eschew anything. They were this is what we play, right? If you talk to Boss Baby Ennis Wilson about his early 7th edition games, it sounds like a nightmare. There were only 4 lists that won anything, but they were really good against each other. And whereas FLG would try to sound by applying these FAQs.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's interesting, and it's interesting what you said, but I also think that, and something that I do want to get into later, is that how things like mission sets and terrain actually are their own form of comp, right? And I do, I could do a whole podcast, I'm sure we could, about whether or not it's a good thing that we're all playing the same missions or not. So maybe that's hint at a future episode. But I definitely think that is its own form of comp in some sense, because it guides and directs armies towards a certain style and build, and in a sense that actually does modify how people build lists and what's good and what's bad. And I think that's just, I think in any game you're going to find that, but the question is by, and I look at Nova as a very classic example. Not only did they have their own missions, but they had their own terrain, and Nova winning armies were often very, very different than armies that would win ITC or Adepticon or any other big events. So it's interesting that I feel like some players have been under the kind of yoke of a comp system for a long time and just not really realized it.
I agree. Nova, Adepticon is the same. They always wanted to do their own thing. And I say that with ITC 100% doing its own thing. Even in 8th edition, when they said we're not going to apply any more of our own FAQs, the ITC mission set was not the GW mission set. But if you look at what they were doing in Europe, they still weren't, they were comboing, right? They were saying we're going to combine Eternal War and Maelstrom to make that our system. And all of it is some kind of a comp to the way you play the game. You mentioned Nova, the Nova winning list. The last time there was a Nova, Siegler, he changed up his list slightly, but enough so that he couldn't, so that he didn't have to afford losing points in certain missions. Um, like the last Adepticon that didn't happen, there were a lot of people that were completely changing their lists because of the mission design, because of what it favored. So yeah, it's 100% a thing. Comp is like this like mystery little thing, but I think really what we're probably want to talk about more is like the firmer style, the like this is how we
Right.
hold you back in terms of scoring points, etc. In an event, right?
Right, and I think obviously this is mostly 40K focused, so I do want to, and I obviously fantasy is my biggest experience with comp, but there's definitely been a history of comp in 40K. So I didn't play much of 7th edition or 6th edition, but I very distinctly remember polls when around the time Knights were just tearing up 7th edition. I remember, and D weapons were kind of a big
Yep.
problem in 7th edition. I do remember polls on the FLG website asking like how many Knights should people be able to play? What should we do with D weapons? How should we modify them? So there's this kind of like, and I don't even want to really call that comp, but in a way they were applying their own set of rules to the game in order to make it, I guess, more balanced or more
Yep.
fun. And the question that I would ask is it ever okay for us as a community to apply, to apply additional rules to the game if it means that the result of those rules is a better playing experience for all involved? Even if that is a very hard question to answer, at the end of the day, if maybe there's one or two players where it's a worse
Yep.
experience, but if the general consensus is that us as a player group can apply specific rules to the game, and as a result, that means it's a better game, it's a more fun game. Is that so wrong? What's so wrong about that?
Yep. No, I don't. I honestly don't think there is something like at the core of it wrong, right? If we were in a situation like if we go back to Iron Hands, which is kind of I think what a lot of people would use as their main example of when a game was at its like most imbalanced. If GW hadn't released an FAQ, week 2 of that release, I there were like we already saw like a lot of TOs being like, I'm just not going to allow codex supplements, right? Like that was a comp they were going to apply to their events because Iron Hands and Imperial Fists were just so strong that it made the game unfun. So if GW hadn't done anything right away, and even then, as months went by and we didn't see more FAQs than what was initially done, we started seeing it again, right? Because as games went on and people didn't find an answer to like a go first Imperial Fist artillery list, or what have you, like we started seeing it again where TOs were like, hey, what do you guys think if I just don't allow codex supplements? Or what if I ban this unit? And it's definitely something that at its core, I don't think there's a problem with. I think where we're at right now, where GW does have its hand a little firmer on the game and releases are so fast, even with COVID, where they've slowed them down, there's still, at least one new release every month, if not two. Like the game is changing so fast that I don't know if I could trust somebody in the community to make the right decision, right? Because there's a lot of information we don't have. Back in the day, when you looked at like 6th and 7th edition, there'd be a new codex every 3 or 4 months tops. So rules didn't change so quickly. It was very easy to be like, we're going to apply this gross and we'll see right away what the impact is, and we'll have a lot of time to fix it. Whereas now, I mean, if we go back to even some of the GW facts, the Castellan and immediately Gladius grab tanks were a major problem. Right? Why no one really had seen it before was because the Castellan just murdered them. So it's
I mean, the nerf
yeah,
does.
right. So it becomes this whole chain. And do we think we can do it better? Is a question that I don't think we can yet. Maybe I'm wrong.
Right. Well, I think where I agree with you there is that because like I think there's that gap. Probably there's that maybe summer of 8th edition
Mhm.
Space Marines came out, where I think you could probably make the argument. I think everyone at that point had received a new book, and it kind of
Yeah,
felt like, okay, this
mostly.
is
Yeah.
it. This is 8th edition. And then obviously they dropped the new Space Marine book on us. I think it was a little bit out of the. Well, I'm sure we all expected a new Space Marine book, um, and I think if you had looked at the kind of vast group of army books, you could have probably made a good assumption that a lot of these books are not going to get rules updates. They're not going to get additional FAQs. And so if there are very, very glaring balance issues, then it's safe. I'd say it's almost safe to make a call and say, okay, well, this is, the edition's kind of matured. And so it's probably a
Mhm.
lot safer to make to be able to make a judgment call. Right now, because we're at the start of the edition, we're only seeing the leg of the elephant. Like, we don't really know the supplement game that's going to be in the future. We don't know the codex game. And to your point about codex releases, I remember a time where there was like an 8-year gap between Dark Eldar codexes. So there, Games Workshop, just like you said, they've definitely turned around. Like the number 1, 2, 3, and 4 reasons that you'd ever want comp back in the day, I think those reasons don't exist, right? And a lot of those things had to do with the fact that there wasn't FAQs. They literally just didn't talk to the community for 2-3 years. Or unless something was like, or if there was an FAQ, it wasn't exhaustive, it wasn't thorough. I mean, I we can argue that they're still not exhaustive or thorough, but like, sometimes it was more like a typo thing. It was like, oh, there's a typo here. It wasn't actually like, they didn't use the FAQs to make balance adjustments. It was sometimes for clarifications, sometimes to maybe fix like a typo, but it was never to actually like fix something or change something because there was a balance issue, right? And then the second,
never a rules interaction problem or anything like that. It was like, oh yeah, we did intend dreadnoughts to be able to move.
Right.
Thanks. Like,
and then I guess the second part of that is like when I used to play like fantasy, and I know this is a bit of a problem in AOS, like, when we talk about it in the best overall show, the reason that best overall was actually like a thing that people cared about was because the armies were so imbalanced that actually winning, going 5-0 at like a GT was not an accomplishment, because it just means you took the most broken flavor of the month army and you could basically just roll people with very little skill, not to the level of today, and you could just basically roll people. And so people didn't look at like winning best general as this big accomplishment. But in the last, like, I'd say like 6 years, that mentality has really changed in a lot of ways, because now, because the armies, almost every army I think can win, right? Almost every army has tools, and obviously there's some that might take a bit of a miracle streak, but I would argue that almost every army right now has at least one build that, and some harder than others, that are competitive, that at least it's not going to be like you're just going to go 0-5. There's no armies where you'll play an event and just by playing that army, no matter what you do, you're always going to be 0-5. But I'd say back in the day, there was a lot of armies like that, where it just didn't matter. Sure. It didn't matter what you did, you're going to go 0-5. Like, so. Yeah, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, sorry.
I'm really into your talk.
Yeah, so that's it. That was just end of my thought. So sorry.
It's okay.
That was my thought.
No, I agree. Like right now, there's like, if you look at, say, at this moment in time, Tau really struggling. Richard Siegler recently came out with a list that looks super fun. I don't think it can win a tournament. Maybe in his hands it could, but it's not going to go 0-5. I mean, it's very similar to a list that another player ran recently that did go 4-1. That player was eventually disqualified for other reasons, but like the core reasoning behind the list is very sound. And then you look at like Guard, which are struggling very hard. They've got a core combo in their army that's extremely powerful. They just need like a little bump. So yeah, like I don't think you're wrong in saying that basically any army has a chance. Maybe not Imperial Fists, but they're still Marines, so there's that going for them. But yeah, like in a spot right now where the old reasons for comp, like you said, don't really exist. Like there isn't like a Tomb Kings or a Beastman, if you want to go back to like Warhammer Fantasy Battle, where you look at an opponent and be like, I wish you played another 300 or 400 points because I don't feel good playing this game right now. Which is when comp came in handy back then. Or, we don't have these bows where you have units of Centurions that can't be targeted by anything and can protect a character as they walk up the board. Like those things don't exist, that can just hammer out anything you want to bring from any other army. So
yeah, and so that actually brings up a really good point. And I've definitely seen those types of comp systems where it's not really any sort of comp system, except they just give. Was it Tomb Kings that used to get like 200 extra points? I think I remember Tomb Kings
250
in Swedish,
Kings,
right?
I think Beastman also got like 100 or something.
So that is like that's a form of comp in a way. It doesn't really hurt anyone. It doesn't penalize anyone. It just gives a little bit of a boost to the lists that are just suffering. So do you think that's a system that could find some traction where maybe the Taus or the Genestealer cults, we're not there to penalize anyone. Anyone can play whatever they want, but maybe there is some merit in saying, okay, well, these lists that are really underperforming, is there something we can do to help them out a little bit rather than, that for me is like the carrot approach, right? Rather than the stick approach. So is there, do you think there's any sort of merit to that approach? And because it's mostly hands off. Like if I say, okay, every GSC and trial player gets an extra 150 points, there's very little like rules engineering. You're not having to change much. It's just, here's a little bit extra points to help you out. Do you think that something like that would ever get traction in the community, or do you think that just starts to kind of have a bit of a slippery slope? I don't know. Oh, did I lose you?
No, I'm back. Sorry, my
Okay.
internet did
No,
disconnect.
right.
But I don't see a problem with that. Just thinking about it, like if I went up against an opponent playing GSC right now and they were like, I would rather play at 2,200 points rather than 2,000. I don't know if I would say no. Like in most cases, unless it was like an Alex McDougall, because screw that guy. What a bad person. Yeah, he's a jerk, and he's not sportsmanlike at all, and he's better at me at the game. So, all of those reasons, like together, I don't want to do it. But yeah, like I think there is something there if someone would be capable of putting the time into it, right? And then you would have to know when to stop, right? There'd have to be a point where you'd say, now it's no longer valid. The game moves so fast, and oftentimes like a small rule tweak here or there drastically change an army. Like you talked about with like the Death Guard FAQ. And we've seen it in other places, like the Forge World Index drop playable immediately because of the Dimacaron. So that's something you just have to put such a finger on. And I think that's the main problem with comp systems is there's no group out there right now that exists that's willing to do it, that's also capable of putting the time and research into making it function. Right? Because there's a lot. We have the data, but you need to have somebody that's willing to sift through it, that's got a knowledge of game design and rules, has a knowledge of what's coming out in the future, that can then be like, okay, I think it's okay to make this change. When Warhammer Community is going to release an article a week later that says, hey, here's this new Sisters of Battle model and it's super broken, Merry Christmas. And just not know that that's going to completely wreck like your whole comp system.
Yeah, so just to kind of call out a few comments in chat. So Brian Horton, hey Brian, if you're still here, hello. He says that if there's and he's a TO as well. He says that if there's general rules modifications to fix issues. Now, obviously, issues is a bit of a loaded word. That's absolutely worth it. So if there's super glaring, catastrophic rules interactions, and I'm trying to think if in the history of 8th, obviously there's more subtle. Like I think that you look at the Broviathan list. That wasn't a set of rules interactions that was like right there in front of you. It was you really had to follow a thread and kind of stack and layer and stack and layer, and eventually when you get to the end of it, you have this monster of a set of interactions. But it wasn't like any one rule that made that thing broken. It was the combination of not just rules but also wording. So how, and the abuse of wording, I guess, to make things kind of work a certain way, when mostly we probably all thought and probably would mostly agree that it didn't seem that it should work that way. But when, we get in this whole argument of rules as written and rules as intended, that's like a big issue. And I mean, and I'll get back to rules as written versus rules as intended, because even those
that's a whole other
that's a whole thing.
But I could talk about that for hours.
Yeah, and I had a pretty big rant on it, because GW likes to. It's like they want you to play rules as intended, but then when you do, they release FAQs that show you, and then when people, you accuse people of power gaming, because you're like, hey guys, even though it says that, I don't think that's the intent, and you should play rules as intended. But then they release FAQs that actually reinforce the rules as written, and then you're like, they like gaslight you, and then they make you feel bad regardless of your choice. But that's a whole different subject.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, Jim. Early in 9th, there was a time where like some people were really hitting hard on rules as written players, and I got a little sassy with the rules as intended guys, and usually I'd be on their side. I think I even got a little sassy with you, over some stuff, and it was just because like we have been ingrained to this, like, this is a gentleman's game, gentleman's agreements. People shouldn't play that way. But then GW does this. And so, and not only that, but we as players, as a community, will often like embrace certain rules as written interactions for no reason, right? And then like poo-poo when somebody else does it. and it's hard for a newer player or like a player that kind of does this kind of basement calculation when they come out and like, hey, I've seen this interaction. Remain stationary says this now, so I can do this, and then like 20 people demolish them in a comment thread. And then you say, well, where were you when Leviathan happened? Why weren't you, stirring the wheels and being like, this shouldn't be a thing regardless, right? But like, this is a whole other beef of mine with how we handle things as a community. Because I don't know what the right answer is. There's a balance and it's hard to find, but yeah, like Brian says here, it's fine when it is amending an issue, but it's so hard to know when it's an issue sometimes. This last weekend, Fabricator Forge had a GT, and Dom Erzingal did make some modifications to the rules for it. He removed the rule chain, the FAQ to fortifications, that you can't deploy a fortification within 3 inches of a terrain piece. Right. He just was like, that's a stupid rule, so we're not playing with it. And there were a couple other things he applied. And I don't think any of his decisions were bad.
Right.
Like, the fortification thing was 100% for the Sisters of Battle Sanctum and some janky stuff you could do with it. But you have to be a real dingus to do it, right? You have to like completely modify how you built the thing to make it function the way people wanted it to. And so I understood 100% his like small modifications to the game to make it work. But
yeah, and I think, a really good example that I can think of is when 9th edition dropped, and I think maybe this is probably where that one time you were yelling at me about rules written versus rules intended, which is people, obviously with an edition change, there's a lot of old interpretations, or the intended part of our rules is intended. Sometimes people think that the intended part is carries from edition to edition. But what we found is actually in 9th edition, a lot of the rule, like think of the Thousand Suns and Grey Knight Smite issue. Yep. People were saying almost ubiquitously that the rule there, they meant to say that rule of like, not being able to not having like worse and worse smites, that was something that they just forgot. Yeah. Hey guys, they just forgot to put that in the new FAQ, and it obviously got to work that way, but turns out no, that's actually the opposite, right? Yeah. And then there was probably at least a dozen rules like that where they had made an FAQ or clarification in 8th edition. They obviously wiped the slate clean in 9th edition, and then people just assumed that those interpretations still applied into 9th edition, and it turned out that actually GW used the opportunity to actually reverse some of those rulings, but it wasn't explicit, right? So there's this sense where people kind of think, and this is kind of, I think, which goes to the larger issue with intention, which is intentions can change over time, right? People, sometimes GW might mean one thing, and sometimes they may later decide, you know what, that's actually not a good idea. We're gonna use this addition to change that rule, and they're not gonna necessarily tell you all the things that they've changed minds on, because GW admitting that they made mistakes is like it's a pipe dream. But I think there is that mentality that like people just assume that there should be some sort of continuity within the idea of intention, and when there isn't, it's actually very just what you mentioned. What happens, which is players get the torches out, and they're like, well, this is how it worked in 8th. So obviously it's got to work that way in 9th. So you asking that question at all means that you're a power gamer and you're just a win-at-all-cost player, etc., and you're awful.
And I hate you.
Yeah. So I think that's an issue. So one thing that you did bring up, and one thing that JB Painting actually said in chat, he's like, if someone wants to play an underpowered lister faction, maybe give them the ability to beautifully paint their force for a painting order example. So I think that actually happens. But one game that Games Workshop has that is my favorite game, close to my heart, where they come out right out of the gate and tell you your army is bad or your faction is bad, is Blood Bowl. And I love Blood Bowl for that, because Games Workshop basically says, here are the good teams, tier A teams, Skaven, High Elves, etc. Here are your bad teams, your Goblins, your Halflings. And so they tell you, hey, don't play these teams. They're advanced teams. You got to be really, really good to make them work. And I actually like the fact that in Blood Bowl, there are certain teams that are worse than others, that are intentionally worse than others, and they're meant to be worse than others. Like they're not meant to be balanced. The game is not meant to be balanced, right? And do you think that that's something that Games Workshop could or should ever introduce to 40K, where they, what they say, we're just tired of having to try to make X faction good. So we're just gonna come up with our own tier list, right? Like the BiffCod guys did. Like we're gonna have our own tier list, and this is where all the factions land. So if you want to play a good list, then it's one of these ones. If you want to play a bad one, it's one of these ones, and that's just how the game's gonna go. And maybe down the road we'll change our mind, but for now, this is the way that the game is gonna go. What do you think of something like that? As from Game Workshop, where
I super hate it. I love it for Blood Bowl. I think it's how they advertise the game and how they push the game that's going to make the big difference there, right? Like Blood Bowl is definitely pushed in this way that it's comical. This is what you can expect. If you want to play it competitively, you just have to know going in, like you're going to spend your whatever $80 on a list, and it's going to be good or bad. We can apply handicap points to you to give you a little bit of an advantage, but that's it, right? And then you have 40K, which they do push with this is serious. Even like crusade rules and narrative rules have very like serious implications. This is a very serious business thing. And like our community has definitely like glomped onto that and said like, this is a game that I can make competitive. And there are people that say like 40K will never be competitive because it relies on dice rolls and stuff. I disagree with that entirely. Once again, a whole other episode.
It relies on randomness, and hey, look, it's one of the most competitive games in the world. Or I don't call it a game, but it's like I guess it is a game, but
all the time.
Sorry?
But to me, like they would have to completely change how they approached 40K in order to even say that. Look at what happened with Age of Sigmar when it launched, right? There was this really core group of Warhammer Fantasy Battle players that were very competitive.
I'm raising
and
my hand if you guys can't see it for those listening to the audio.
Like I was so hardcore about like my Lizardman lists were gross. Everybody that I played against hated them unless they were just as competitive as me. But like that was the thing, and then I launched, and they were like, "Hey, here's a bunch of jokes we've added to units. Like if you kneel at this time, then you get this. If you can roll a 13 on 2 die, you automatically win the game. Just like silly things. Like your beard is better than your opponent's, then you get +1 strength, and it like literally infuriated people. They were so mad that their game became a joke, and that GW had decided that Age of Sigmar was going to be a beer and pretzels game, and they were very open about it. Like, this is a game you're going to play with your mates for an hour and have some fun, like, in your garage. And all these Warhammer Fantasy Battle players, myself included, were just like, why did you ruin this beautiful thing that I loved? I thought you could just make it better by taking more time with it. And it worked so poorly, they completely changed how they approached the game. Within 2 years, they released their first General's Handbook and were like, yeah, here's points, guys. If you want to play it this way, it's not how we intended, but we're going to make it work. And it's getting to a point where it is a competitive game. It probably already is, and I'm just holding back because of my anger from whatever 6 years ago now.
Same, man. I think I'm in some sort of support group. We need a support group for like disgruntled fantasy players that can't let go of like what they
fantasy grognards, right?
Yeah.
Like, but yeah, like that's a thing. So yeah, they'd have to completely change their approach to the game. Not only that, they would then also have to like take the hit of what's going to probably be like 6 years of so much hate from a dedicated fan base.
Right.
Right? Because even like their narrative players will be like, no points, none of this. Like you want to say that my Iron Warriors are a bad army? Well, fuck you. Right? Like that's something that we would have to take with us to the grave.
So that actually brings up a really interesting question. And I agree with you for the most part. Blood Bowl, at the end of the day, if my Blood Bowl team sucks, it costs me $80 to get another one and maybe like a few days to paint it, and I'm back in. Like I'm not spending $1,500 to $2,000 on an army, hundreds of hours painting it, only to find out it's awful, and then having to do that again, right? Like the buy-in for a Blood Bowl team is very small. In fact, I have more Blood Bowl teams than I have 40K armies, right? Or and other games combined. Like I have like 4 teams for Blood Bowl, right? And it is a jokey game, but it is very competitive as well because there's obviously I'd actually argue that at the highest levels, like if you look at like the Spike Cup, they do the Thunder Bowl here in Vancouver. There's 4 international tournaments for Blood Bowl that are national tournaments where there's upwards of 500-600 players that travel for these events, and they are extremely competitive. So Blood Bowl, and obviously just like any event, there's gonna be some proportion that are there just to play Blood Bowl and roll dice. But
yeah, for sure, just like LVO or anything else.
Right, but like Blood Bowl, I would argue has just as competitive of a scene as any of the other Games Workshop games. So it's not like that the people that play Blood Bowl are not competitive players, because they definitely are. But I think they all go into that environment understanding they all understand the environment, so they all know what they're going to get. I have 4 teams, but I only play Skaven, by the way, because they're the best. So actually, and another point, I guess, question I want to ask you is, what do you think Games Workshop, and this is maybe me putting on my tinfoil hat a little bit and being a little conspiratorial. Now, I know Games Workshop has done a lot in the last 5 years to kind of reach out to the community. Like, before Warhammer community existed and Games Workshop was back on social media, this was in the Tom Kirby days. There was the dark times, right? That was like, I'd quit the game. The game was in an awful state, and if you talk to the people that kind of hung on, like the Reeses of the world, who basically tried to do everything they could to kind of keep the game alive, or who were ready to quit, they would tell you that the game was in a very bad space. Now, obviously, in the last 5 years, we've had a lot of improvements, but I don't think anyone would sit here and say Games Workshop is amazing or great. And I know oftentimes you talk to Rob, and he, I don't play AOS, but I absorb the AOS salt through Rob. And so as someone that loosely follows AOS, and I keep every edition, every book that comes out with AOS, the models are gorgeous. I'm always like, I want to get into AOS. But there's certain things like priority roll that I can't do it. I can't do it. And now these new vampire counts came out. I don't care what they're called, but they're called vampire counts. And I'm like, I want to start vampire counts. And I'm really worried that because, as Rob mentions, each book seems to be written by different people. I'm worried that I'm going to start building this army, and it's going to be objectively awful. And there's no path to balance. Anyways, I'm getting long, but my question is, how much do you think Games Workshop knows that their game is unbalanced, or the armies are unbalanced? And second, do you think in some way there's a business decision behind that? Because if your army's always good, or the armies are quite balanced, there really isn't an incentive to, besides just your own like wanting to collect a new army, to buy another army. So do you think that, kind of in the deep dark office towers of Games Workshop, that there is a business decision made to actually have this kind of rotating, it's kind of like Game of Thrones, right? The wheel turns, right? So one team's on top, then another faction's on top, and another faction's on top, and on it goes. Do you think that that's something that Games Workshop does intentionally? They're aware of that? Or do you think that's just kind of like, incidental of the way that they write rules?
So I think there was a time where they didn't care at all, the Tom Kirby kind of era that we've talked about, right? Where you had like articles by Jervis Johnston that basically said like, rules don't really exist. They're suggestions. We would prefer if you just made up your own rules, right? Like that was an infamous White Dwarf article. And then we have this new era that started with the playtesting for 8th edition, where they brought in the Mournival, and they seemed to be like really careful about releases. Things were still broken, but you could tell how they could have been missed. I think that there's probably some dude at GW that understands when something's unbalanced and doesn't care, because it adds a little bit of a selling point. But I don't think like the company ever looks at that. Like, I think that, because I see that a lot. I see a lot of people that are like, well, power imbalance, it drives sales. Power creep drives sales. And there are definitely companies that 100% do it. I just don't believe GW is that. I think that there's a lot of things that go into, especially now in our kind of COVID era, a lot of problems that have been created for them that keep that from being the real reason. When you consider that a lot of these releases should have happened almost simultaneously, for example, I think that kind of creates this aura of power creep that isn't technically there. Where like we're looking at Drukhari and we're like, man, this is super busted. How did playtesters miss it? Or why did GW ignore the playtesters? But then you think, well, AdMech should have probably released in the same week. Mm-hmm. Or we should have had 3 more codexes since, right? Like we're like 6 months behind on what I believe their codex launch would have looked like. And when you think about it that way, it's a lot different. If you're like, well, AdMech might have been a direct counter to Drukhari or Grey Knights, and they haven't been released yet, or Orcs. A lot of combos don't seem as bad. And then you say, well, are Orcs bans, and that's why they didn't care about this thing, because like it's a rock paper scissors situation. Like those are things that I think about because I try to keep this happy face on it, that it has nothing to do with sales because to them sales are driven by models still, right? Like they know that competitive players buy a lot of models, but we're still such a small percentage of their actual player base that I'm not sure the hit is as strong as we would love for it to be, right? Like sure, the whatever model is broken sells out really fast on like the Warhammer website, but I don't think that's what's driving their overall sales.
Yeah, it's
right. I don't think the fact that they sold 50 attack bikes one day because they only had 50 in the shop is the big thing, right?
Yeah, and I think there's three. I agree with you. I think there's three really good examples of exactly what you're talking about. Which is the first, and you mentioned the community at a large is mostly not competitive. If you look at some of the biggest YouTube channels, Twitch channels, they're not competitive channels. We're talking mini wargaming, fully narrative, Miniac, lots of painting channels, lots of hobby channels. Almost all of the largest social channels for like fan content is not competitive. In fact, the competitive channels are generally smaller. They're the smallest of that like group. So in general, the amount of people that actually consume competitive content at the high level is a lot less than the broader group. And I think that's not a surprise to anyone, I don't think, but I think it just proves that point that the majority of the sales are from non-players, and not just not competitive players, but sometimes not even players. Like there's a lot of people that I follow as painters, like the guys from Cult of Paint, like Emil from Squidmar. They don't actually they paint almost exclusively Games Workshop, and none of them actually even play the game, right? They just recognize they make the best models in the world, which they do, and they play the game. So that's the first point. The second point is, with your attack bike example, right? Everyone was saying that firstborn Marines, so like non-Primaris Marines, were going to basically get written out of the book because Games Workshop is trying to phase them out. And I actually even saw the interview with Jervis Johnson where he did on the Warhammer 40K podcast, where he basically said they actually have like 10 years of Marine releases planned out. Like the project was to basically reimagine the entire Marine range, and then over some amount of time, I'm sure it'll be multiple years, multiple editions, they're going to essentially refresh the entire range. And so a lot of people were tinfoil hatting that, well, they're now going to start making really awful rules for the firstborn Marines, so the old Marines, and as a result, and then everyone will be forced to buy Primaris. Well, what have we seen? Vanguard Veterans, one of the best units of the game. Attack Bikes, one of the best units of the game. Deathwing Terminators, one of the best wings into the game. So we're not seeing that. It's literally not happening. And then the third point is, if that was the case, then every new unit would be good so that they can sell it. But I can tell you, as someone that plays Death Guard, the Lord of Violence is not good. There's a lot of units that are released, and I think this is
how many competitive players have bought a Gladiator anything?
Right.
Gladiator anything,
right? Or even the speeders, right? Like they very often release units that are dead on arrival from a competitive standpoint, and people are just like, this is just not good. This is just not good, and like the rules are bad. So I think it's very obvious to me on at least on the surface, that there isn't some like nefarious puppet master that's saying, okay, well, add an extra attack here, drop the points a little bit there because we want to sell that model. I actually think my confusion is why not? Because if I was Games Workshop, I would make that connection and say, if something has good rules, it sells, the model sells. So let's make sure, and it doesn't mean overpowered rules, but I mean good rules, right? So at least playable rules. And I think sometimes Games Workshop really surprises me with like how bad the rules are for their brand new releases, to the point where people immediately day one, they're like, yeah, this is just never going to get played. And that actually is something that really surprises me, because I would assume that they would try a little bit harder to at least make every new model kit that they release playable and good. Because I keep looking at these new Sisters releases, the Castigator tank, the chicks in robots, and now we got the halberd chicks. That's all. I don't even know the names of the units. That's what they are to me.
Yep.
I would bet you 2 out of 3 of those units are not going to make appearances in competitive Sisters armies. That tank probably will never see play unless it's severely undercosted or something like that. Like that whole like concept of like track tanks on a Rhino chassis is just dead. Like, when was the last time you saw a Predator on the table? So I just don't see any scenario where that tank is good unless they they do something outrageous to it. But I just bet you 2 out of 3 of those units, the new Sisters units we've seen so far, are just not going to be good. Do you remember Harkon World Leader? the Chaos Space Marine
Yeah,
release.
they had to change the rules on twice
Yeah, like
because
did
like he was
anyone
so
ever
bad,
use
and then they
him?
made
He
him
was a
worse.
gorgeous model. Did anyone ever play with him when he came out? No.
In one list
Yeah, so
maybe,
he was
and
just objectively awful
it
right out
wasn't
of the
good.
gates. Everyone was like, "Yeah, this is just bad,"
Yep,
and then they tried to fix him. Yeah,
and they
they
nerfed him.
nerfed him. So I do think
Yeah.
that there is this like disconnect almost between like it's almost like they still haven't made that connection in their brains, and that when the units are good, it's almost accidental.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think like, and we've seen interviews in the past that kind of shown it. I think there was a really cool interview that I've talked to people about. And I want to say sixth edition with the Wraith Knight when it became like absolutely broken for a while. Maybe it was the Scathach version, the Forge World one, where like the guy that was creating the rules went to higher up and was like, "Hey, look, like I think it would be really cool if it did this and it had a D weapon instead of what it's got right now." And the guy was like, "Yeah, that sounds super awesome." And he's like, "Yeah, so I'll add like 40 points to it." And he was like, "Why would you add points to it? Just release it as is." And then and the guy's like, "Well, because it would be unbalanced." He's like, "I don't like who plays this game that way." And like, because like that was he wasn't doing it purposely to sell the model. He was like, "This is a cool rule, add it, don't change anything else." And I think like that's the mentality for a lot of it, right? Is like these are cool rules and it will play narratively very well. But like from a competitive standpoint, we don't care as much as long as, it doesn't cause a huge uproar like we saw with Iron Hands. I think that's kind of like their limit. And like I don't talk a lot to playtesters. I try not to anymore because I don't want to be that guy. But I remember like after Iron Hands, people telling me like basically as long as it's not as broken as Iron Hands, we'll probably sit on it for a little bit.
Yeah.
Like it's like because like even when they fixed Iron Hands, that caused a whole other uproar that like the competitive community didn't see, right? Like there were a lot of casual players that bought it, like loved their Iron Hands, and they bought all these models, and then they were told all their rules didn't work anymore, right? And so that causes a whole other pain for them, where they're like, people are like trying to return their repulsors, and they're like, "Yeah, I bought 3 repulsors, and like I can't play my fun games with them anymore." Like it's a double-edged sword.
I definitely bought 3 repulsors, and I think I ended up trading them in because I didn't open them, and I'm actually very frugal in that way. Where although I do have 24 assault centurions that I never ended up getting to play because by the time I finished painting them, they were nerfed. So I feel that, right? Now, one thing that I do want to touch on though is in regards to I guess the kind of the topic, which is should comp systems make a return, is one of the things that you brought up earlier was, well, no one person wants to do this. And something that I've advocated for in the past is, and I always think of like unions as a really good example, is like kind of the idea of collective bargaining and collective power and like worker power. And, I really think of us as like the kind of the workers of Games Workshop in a lot of ways. And, my dream would be is if we could organize in some way as a community, whether it's the ETC, the WTC, the ITC, whatever TCs you want to talk about, the Swedes, the Spaniards, sorry, people in Antarctica, whoever.
The Spains.
The Spains, yeah. So if there was some way where, and I think there are, like you never want to be like, oh yeah, this person should do it and this person should do it. Because someone always has to lead that drive. Someone needs to emerge, or a group of people need to emerge with a real desire to make those changes and push that. And I think, in the past, we definitely saw FLG take a little bit of that role. And obviously now, especially with the fact that, and I don't know I don't know what kind of arrangement they have with GW. Like as far as I understand, they're not even on the playtest team anymore. And I don't think that Reese and Frankie will be doing commentating or anything like that for GW soon. So it seems to me actually their relationship with GW is even less than it was in 8th edition. It's less entwined, I guess. And again, I don't know the details, but this is just based on public knowledge of what they've said, and what I know is like they're even less involved with the development of the game. They're less involved with like the GW on the stream side, competitive side. And so it seems to me that it's odd for me that they're now really, really shying away from and Reese even said at some point like they had an agreement with GW. But I'm like, well, agreement over what? Like, what do they like? What they're gonna like shut down? Like, not sell you guys any more models? Like, I'm not quite sure what leverage GW had to ever even tell them what they could and couldn't do. And now, so they've kind of taken a step back. The team at the FLG that ran the ITC from like any sort of like FAQs, subset of missions. We did see Adepticon and Nova kind of preemptively adopt all the rules. So, and obviously we know Mike Brandt is now part of the big corporate like machine. But it was funny. I do remember when Jason, I think Jason Lippert released the Adepticon rules, there was like outrage over the 5 turns, and obviously I think he knew something, right? Everyone was like, "Why the hell are
Yep.
we playing 5 turns? This is so outrageous." There was so much like Nick. I remember me posting, Nick posting. There was like a whole. Everyone was up in arms about 5 turn games. Well, lo and behold, didn't we look dumb? The game actually decided to go to 5 turns. So I guess my point
Yep.
is what do you think? Like, do you think there's a pathway where some of these, I hate to use the word prominent, but some of these larger groups that maybe have a lot of players kind of in their communities, whether it's the WTC, the ITC, could come together and maybe using that kind of democratic approach, either come up with some of those things that you're saying that one person doesn't want to come up with, or at least apply pressure as a group to Games Workshop. Like, maybe they don't do any of their own comp, but they are essentially our union leaders, and they kind of go to Games Workshop with our demands, right? So when it comes to balance issues or other kinds of things, there is like a kind of a group that emerges out of this community that we have, that the community can really look to be on our side, to really fight for the players as a whole. Do you think that's something that could ever happen, or do you think GW's kind of swallowed all the little fish and now we're whoa, you just got really big. Yeah. So like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I kind of feel like I want something like that really badly. I want to unionize.
I think there's something there that we should have. I think for a lot of us, having Brant kind of put on the team felt like, we've made it. We now have somebody that kind of roughly understands how we feel, like in it, helping create the rules, design it, build. And now he's kind of in the weeds and trying to make stuff happen. Right now, the
is
only
he doing anything? What has he been doing for a year, Mr. Events manager?
So like we have that. I think the WTC right now is like the only organization that has enough sway that could do something like this, along with the captains when they do their votes. And I think a big thing with that, because we know, like, I believe Tom is part of the maybe Isaac too. I don't remember who all from their group is.
Sure.
So like they do have a say. Like, and Tom is always leading me on with, "Hey, we brought it up. Don't worry, it'll be an FAQ." And then whether or not it actually gets FAQ'd is a whole other story. But like I think they're right now the only community that can, and they're not very well embraced by the North American side, right? Like WTC is kind of like it's getting stronger.
It's getting stronger though, for sure.
But like it's not there yet, right? So we still have this independent tournament circuit created by FLG where the TOs can say and do what they like, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Like everyone that's listening, where I think it's cool and great, but I would love to see them come together more. Like all these TOs from all these big events, not just Reese and Frankie, not just Tom, but like our community as a whole should be able to come together, do like actual democratic voting and be like, "Hey, we think this is a problem." Use actual data and statistics to back up those problems if we need to, and kind of force change.
Right.
I don't know if we're capable of that. Just from the few times people have tried, right? Like anytime I've ever seen someone say, "Hey, I think this is a problem," generally it gets immediately poo-pooed. It's immediately like, "You don't know what you're talking about. Like, we're not going to modify this game. Just play it the way it is." Now we've also, I don't think, ever had a problem other than Iron Hands that was bad enough
Yunari got nerfed pretty bad pretty quickly. They're awful. Like right at the start too, when they were like, quick. No, it wasn't quick, but I'm just saying, like,
quick. The nerf wasn't quick, but when it happened, it was a hammer. It was definitely like a message was sent.
But they were there. I'm saying, like, it wasn't quick, but their win rate and power was Iron Hands level, I'd argue, at the peak. Now they got like multiple nerfs, and even after like the third nerf, they were still pretty good. But like they had to get nerfed like 3 times. But
but I think that's a thing. Like I think we just need to be more proactive, but we also have to be willing as a group to get together and say, like, "Hey, this is a problem. Please do something about it. Be polite about it, not angry." But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. Like WTC is really the strongest like voice, but they need a little more respect on the North American side. I think they deserve that respect. I know the guys know that I believe that firmly. but that's really it right now. Like, I don't know if there's any other voice. Reese and Frankie, like you said, have kind of had to go quiet for one reason or another. I mean, they're about to start a massive circuit, right? This FLG circuit is going to be huge. We're looking at a major 8 months out of the year, super major, 8 months out of the year from them alone, possibly more.
Don't remind me, both of us stuck up here, not being able to go anywhere in Canada.
Dude. So we're looking at
so
minimum,
jealous.
like 12, 13 super majors a year, between the, like, around the world. Like, this is the chance where we can say that kind of stuff, where we can go like, hey, maybe please don't have a succubus with 42 attacks, because we're just not going to allow it. We're going to make an FAQ for ourselves where we deny that, right? I guess that is something we could do. It's just whether someone will ball up and do it.
Right. And so do you think moving forward, like, we can obviously have, we can be the loudest voices as a community, but do you think that, and this is something that I just saw the job postings for 40K lead designer, AOS lead designer. I'm not sure if the people that were in those roles got moved, or they're growing it and adding an additional, like, I'm not really sure why those positions all of a sudden became open all at once. Like, if it was just one of those at once, I'd say, oh, like, maybe the person that was in that role left. But the fact that all 4 of them are immediately all open at once shows to me that either it's a new role or they're doing some restructuring in the future to kind of bring more people in to support. Maybe they want to add another layer of management, whatever, right? Who knows why? But I look at, like, their job postings and they're like, oh, we want to bring someone in, like, I almost think it's in jest. I'm like, I saw Pete Foley literally posted it in the Comp 40K forum on Facebook, and I was like, are you joking? Like, are you guys seriously thinking that you'd hire someone out of this group? Because I personally think, and I worked for Games Workshop when I was very young, and I've talked to lots of people that work for Games Workshop at all levels, and the company doesn't work like that. They very, very rarely, unless it's for like a technical role like sculptor, painter, when it comes to games design, rules design, if you're not already heavily into that ecosystem, already doing those things at Games Workshop, it's almost unheard of for them to go hire, the stats guy out of the Comp 40K forum because he sent in a really nice video where he was really enthusiastic. Like that, the idea that that's how they would do it seems totally insane to me, right? That they would just hire this guy because he's, they're like, oh, don't send us your resume, send us an interview while you're right for this job. So some guy puts together a really cool video and he's going to be the new rules guy. And I guess my point is where I'm going with this is, so we know that they're in a place right now where it seems like they're still going through lots of growing pains, but what role do you think the players should have moving forward? Because it seems to me that oftentimes Games Workshop likes to say that they know best. Like, you players stay out of it. We don't want to hear from you, or we don't think that what you're saying is necessarily valid. And that was a lot of the old Games Workshop, but there's still a lot of that right now because and maybe they kind of put on the facade that no, they actually do want to hire the players into playtesting, into the development team. And if they do, if that ends up happening, like I will eat my foot basically. But if I hear in 6 months that someone from the Comp 40K forum like got hired into the playtest team that wasn't already working for Games Workshop, that had no prior games development experience, or someone that didn't even play 40K got put into that role, which is very rare, I will be totally shocked. But I guess knowing that Games Workshop often thinks that they know best, what role do you think the players should have or could have moving forward to help keep the game in a healthy place? Because if we're saying that we don't want comp systems, what should we be doing as a community to keep the game healthy and to keep it fun? Because sometimes I do feel like there should be something for us to do.
I think that the biggest thing is we need to have our voices heard, but we need to do it the right way. It's just like in any business or like any other hobby that you've seen. Like, there's a lot of screeching. There's a lot of screeching in our hobby. There's a lot of this is broken when it's not really broken. COVID has, I think, made it even worse because now people that used to have great takes probably don't have the best takes because they're not playing the actual game. Maybe they're playing on TTS and perfect maps, or by their opinion, perfect maps, but they haven't really played it in real life. Or maybe they're only getting games against a close-knit community of 2 or 3 players. So they like what they're seeing isn't the full picture. I think what we really need and it's something we've started seeing with like the Goonhammer articles, and with just some certain thought out posts, I guess you could say, in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Like what we really need is a group that's willing to like say, here's a problem, here's why it's a problem, show your work, and then have some way to follow up and be like, hey, like this is still a problem, here's why I think it is, here's the work I put into it, someone correct me or move forward, right? Like we have to be able, just like when I used to sting for like big oil, and I would go through like myriad spreadsheets trying to find a problem with like certain electronic devices, etc. Like I'd have to show my work, and then I'd go to somebody and be like, I think I have a problem, 100% sure, can you please look at it? And then they would basically redo what I did and come back. We need to be able as a community to do that without screeching. We have to do it and say like, not everything is broken, the sky isn't falling, certain things will just be fixed. Like the storm shield problem at the beginning of 9th, where everybody was up in arms because everything is invulnerable now. Like,
and the rules weren't even out.
You could say like, yeah, like you could have that conversation and be civil, but a lot of people weren't. Like a lot of people were like, the game is done. GW fucked up so bad. How can they even say they know how to make a system when all you have to say is, yes, we understand this is how this rule probably is meant to be written, but this is how it is written. Here's my backup for it. Because I had to have this conversation with like 100 people and be like, this is why it's a legitimate concern. It's never going to be a problem though, guys, right? Like you have to be willing to say it with like straight faced, with a level head. You can't be like, eradicators are the worst thing this game has ever seen, without backing it up with proof. And you can't just use like percentages. You can't be like, well, I rolled 30 dice and this is what happens every time,
right?
Because it's not the game setting, right? It's something I've really enjoyed about the Goonhammer articles, where they've kind of come out and been like, here's all this work we've done. I wish we'd go deeper,
right?
And they go really deep, right? But I think we could do it better, even than what they're doing, if we had the time for it. And I think GW could too. And I think that's the thing. Like we need to be able to go to them and be like, hey, I think this is a problem. Can you please back up our numbers somehow?
Yeah,
that's what I would like. I would like that in a community. Like I would like this person that's like developing the game, bring in somebody that's willing to do that extra work, so that they listen to the community, they can filter out the screeching, find the level heads, and then focus from there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And, I guess my one kind of comment on that is that sometimes the data isn't enough because, I always think of a famous example of Robin Crudis at Nova 2019, where he was watching, I think maybe one of the invitational games, where someone deep struck.
He was watching Stephen
Yeah, he deep struck a Blood Angels captain on top of a ruin, and then made a 1-inch charge.
Giant elf.
Yeah, made a 1-inch charge off of it because it was flyer, so he ignored. And like, it didn't matter how many game stats he gave Robin. He's just not playing the game the same way. So like, it's not about the stats. It's about how they're actually using the rules that are there. And I actually don't think, this is going back to the rules, written rules intended. I think everyone thought that that's how the game's supposed to be done. I mean, obviously the guy's got a jump pack. Why wouldn't he be able to jump off really easily, right? And then obviously we had like 13 FAQs trying to, there's so many changes to fly and charging and all sorts of other movement rules as a result of that one little thing. And that was in 2019. So that was 2 years ago. That wasn't like at the start of the edition. So the edition had already been played for 2 years, and he didn't realize 2 years in that this is actually how this rule works. So there's a 2-year kind of like gap, right? And so when I look at something like that, I'm like, yeah, go ahead.
I just like, when I say stats, I'm not just talking about stats. I mean like being able to prove your work.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be like, hey, here's an example of a game. See what happens. Show it to them. Can you please tell me if that interaction is correct, right? If we go back, another example, the Magos with the possible infinite kill combo in Gene Stealer cults, Magus or Patriarch.
Like the infinite loop of dice rolling, basically?
Yeah, you would like compare leadership, and then if you rolled over that you did a mortal wound, and you just kept going until you either tied but you could make a Patriarch leadership 13. Like that was an example where people screeched a lot. And then there were actual like level-headed people in the community were like, yes, I see it, but it's never going to be a problem. But we waited like 2 weeks, and it happened on stream multiple times, right? Like I think Nick Rose did it to some dude's Night Castellan and one shot it, and you're like, oh, okay. like this is a problem. But this is like showing your work. It doesn't have to be a statistic. It can be like, here's a video like explaining what I'm trying to show you. Like, is this how the game's supposed to be played? But we need those level heads, and they need to have like some direct connection.
Yeah.
And we need to be able to pick them out, right?
Yeah, and I do want to thank you, Peter. For those who don't know, Peter runs 40kstats.com. I think I got that right. And
Yep.
I think in a lot of ways, exactly what you just mentioned, the tireless work of being level-headed and just looking at the data, looking at the math is something that I think before you did it, it just didn't exist. And a lot of websites now use that data because they're all too lazy to go do it themselves. And I think it's I think it's a huge benefit for the community. And I don't think you get enough credit for the amount of work that you do that goes into it. Because I can't even deal with like looking at one BCP event because the interface is so awful. So I'm not sure actually how you go through and find all these list files info. I don't know if you have some sort of secret Peter version of like BCP, but generally,
Nope.
like I struggle with just even going through one event and looking at lists because the interface is so awful. So the fact that you literally will go through like 20, 30, 40 events in a weekend, compile the data, put it together, like I think that's like big unsung hero. So big props for that. That's like a huge thing. And also posting the top 4 lists usually in the or at least links to them. That's a huge amount of work, and you do that totally on your own, totally for free, on your own time. And I think people don't. And I'm not trying to kiss your ass here, but I don't think people realize that before having that kind of data, it was a lot of speculation. It was a lot of conjecture. It was a lot of skies falling.
Mm-hmm.
But then you look at the math and you're like, you know what? It's either not as bad as we thought, or fuck, it's way worse than we thought. And I think that having that data, and it's really something that I wish Games Workshop would, like, I love the fact that when I used to play MMOs, guess what every MMO has where there's PvP? There's leaderboards, right? There's stats. Yep. There's like Diablo 2, World of Warcraft, think of any like major competitive sport game, and I'm sure Val will want to talk about this a lot when we get into the esports conversation next week. But stats are available, data's available. And I think Games Workshop, with very little work, and I look at something like the ITC and the structure that they've built, and I remember, I can't remember what podcast I heard it on, but someone said, oh, Games Workshop bought the ITC. Not FLG, but the ITC. And I was like, what? Where did they hear that? But I was like, you know what? That's actually what they should do. Not necessarily the ITC as it is. They should buy like the back end, like the data, like the software essentially that runs the ITC rankings, put it on the Games Workshop site, make their own changes that they want to do, and re-release it as the Games Workshop International Ranking System. Immediately, you're going to get the entire community jumping on there. ITC will be like, thank God, we don't have to fucking deal with this anymore. And second, you're gonna have an official Games Workshop like ranking, and maybe you can add things like achievements, right? You could do all that, and I'm sure, as I said, I'm sure I'll have a lot to talk about it. But I guess my point is, I think Games Workshop needs to do a better job of like managing their own game, because I think sometimes they leave too much of it to the players. Especially once it's out in the wild. Now, obviously, they have their own internal playtesting teams. They have their own internal like rules writers. But usually, once a book is released, there's really no follow-up from them unless they hear something. It's not like, hey, we're gonna go and do some investigation and keep a really close eye on this, talk to the community, look at the events, and just make sure that we got it right. That there's no, like, when you release software out in the wild, what do you do for the first, like, your butt is clenched, and you're hoping, and you're going to monitor it for the first while to make sure it doesn't crash, there's no bugs, there's nothing game breaking, right? Whatever. That's what most software engineers do when they release software. They don't just like say, okay, well, it's been shipped, so I'm going to go do something else, and I don't care what happens to it. No, the first like month where software, that's when you get the day zero bugs, right? You get all the critical vulnerabilities. So as a software, and I'm not a software engineer, I just assume the work starts when it's released. Like the real work starts is to make sure that it doesn't explode and blow up people and crash planes, right? And which in some cases it did, right? And like, I think Games Workshop needs to do a better job of, I guess, shepherding their products after they've made the money, right? I often kind of sometimes think that they, once it's released, for the most part, unless, as you mentioned, there's a huge uproar, they're very, very like happy to just let it kind of exist. What do you think of that?
I agree. I think that there's a little bit of like, this is my baby's syndrome that happens with codexes as well, especially now. I think there's definitely, I think GW's come so far in the last 4 years that it can be hard to say, like, to acknowledge a big mistake, right? Like if you go in and you do a test in school and you get a C average person your whole life, and then you work your ass off and you're like, you memorize everything, you go into an exam and you come out with a B, and you're like, what the fuck did I get a B for? I've worked harder than I've ever done in my life on this. This should be an A plus. You like that's a situation that I think you can find that you can find yourself in.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would hate to be like Mike Brandt, help create a new edition, and then get told it was bad,
mm-hmm.
right? Which I don't think it is, by the way. I think 9th edition is fantastic for the most part.
I agree.
But you create this baby situation now, right? Where any criticism is hard to hear, hard to feel. And so like you get like first turn advantage is a problem, and you're like, are you sure it's a problem? Like this edition is perfect. It's my baby. I've worked harder on this than I've worked on anything in my entire life. Go fuck yourself, right? That's like your inner. And I think that's something we sometimes will see with these codexes. I don't think it's a laziness factor. I think there's a lot of we put our heart and soul into this. We love this, and I don't want to accept that there's a problem.
Yeah. And hopefully,
and I think,
yeah, go ahead.
And that's it. Sorry, like what I was going to say doesn't matter. So continue.
Yeah, I was just going to say, hopefully that's something that, like, from what I understand, and anytime I read job applications for GW, they're very explicit with like how much feedback you get and how much like they're like, oh, if you're gonna be a sculptor, be ready to be kind of criticized. If you're a writer, be ready to be torn down and told your writing sucks. If you're a rules writer, be ready to have like 13 people jump up your ass and tell you how shitty it is, right? Mm-hmm. Like they say that in all the job applications. Like you got to be ready to take that criticism and still hit your deadlines. So it's kind of weird. It's always odd to me. It's like you'd think that they already have a culture of accepting criticism from each other, from their colleagues. And so it's always odd to me that once something hits the wild, then they're like, oh, well, yeah, now it's so good. And maybe it's a result of the fact that they think they've done all the hard work already. They've heard all the criticism. What could there be left? We've already, we had all the other game designers take a look at this and they all said it was fine. So you guys are just, plebes that don't really know anything. So I think that's really interesting. So, yep. All right, Peter. Well, it's been about an hour and a half. So I do appreciate your time and I want to be mindful of it. I know I don't know if it's actually later there. What is it, 9:30 there where you are?
Yeah, okay. It's an hour later. Cool. It's fine.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, no.
We didn't really talk too much about. We talked about comp, but we kind of adjacency'd it in the end.
Yeah.
Right?
Is there any? Yeah. I guess. Do you have any further thoughts on comp and anything that you think that we maybe need to talk? I think we both kind of agree it's not something that is needed. I think that's probably fairly.
I don't think right now it is.
Yeah, but I definitely do want to.
I think we went down the right path of. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that there could potentially come a point where we need to step in and say like, hey, WTC, hey, Reese and Frankie, I don't know if you have an agreement where you're not allowed to do it, but we would really love if you did. We would really love if you fix this problem because it's not getting fixed on time. I don't think we should ever go back to the Swedish tournament comp days. For people that don't know what Swedish tournament comp was like, because we never even really explained it, it was like a huge fact document that was like 20, 30 pages long just from the FAQ standpoint. And then every army had an additional point cost on top of the ones you would normally pay. And then you would get a score for your list. And the lower your score, it was considered more strong, like the stronger your list was. So the way, so Swedish tournament comp would say like, if you want to attend this event, your list has to have a score of like a 12 or higher. You can't be any less. Yeah, you're not allowed to
I actually downloaded the last version of the Swedish comp system, the 8th edition comp system, so I could kind of have it. It's 84 pages long. There's 6 pages at the start that explain to you how it works. And then each individual book has its own very specific, very individual list of requirements. And so you had to not only understand how the general system worked, but then you had to write your army list like you normally would, and then calculate a Swedish comp score for it. And generally most tournaments would say, okay, your army has to be between a range of X, like 10 and 12, or this event can have any up to scores as high as 20 or as low as 5. And so essentially what you do is it would hard score your list based on how good it was or bad it was. And as long as you were like within the margins of that specific event, you could take that list. What I did like about this though, and this is someone that did coming from that, and ISA, I remember just like what I liked about it is it did lend like it, even though it tried to have balance, because it is a player made thing, there was still points where there was like certain break points where there was like it wasn't an even curve. It was very like up and down, right? So you try to always bring your list to a certain kind of maximum, like the peak of certain breakpoints. And if someone didn't do the exact same thing as you, then even though there's a comp score and the idea is that the lists are balanced, they're still not balanced. And so I found that in the end, it didn't actually fix anything. It just created a bunch of headaches and a bunch of paperwork, additional paperwork. Plus, it was incredibly hard to maintain and complex. And I just, yeah. And again, you got to remember, guys, this is coming from a day and age where armies would go sometimes 6-7 years without a book. I'm pretty sure, was it Wood Elves or maybe not, maybe it's Bretonnians? They didn't get a book for like 2 editions. Tomb Kings didn't get a book for
Yeah,
two
they didn't
editions.
get a 7th edition book. They didn't get an 8th
Yeah.
edition book. Tomb Kings also, yeah, they were the first 8th edition book.
Yeah.
And it was bad.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't even a
Sorry,
good
the first 7th
book.
edition book, I think.
Was it 7th? Maybe. It was one of them.
Sixth,
But like,
I think
when it
actually
came out, it was
sixth.
awful.
I think it's sixth. Yeah, it doesn't matter. But armies would go 2 editions or more without army books. And I think if you're in that environment, there's a point where the armies get so bad and so out of balance where, and if 40K ever gets to that point, I think we'll probably be having this conversation again. But as you said, like the release schedule and, putting COVID aside, I think we all expected probably 3/4 of the army books to probably be up by the end of the year, like 2021 at least. And obviously that's not going to be the case. And I'm curious, and because of the fact that there's not a ton of events, there isn't this urgency to change things, right? Now, I'd imagine closer to the end of this year, 2021, as these super majors start to ramp up, as bigger events start happening, as some communities in certain countries, not ours, start to being able to do stuff, we could see some more balance issues emerge as the number of games that people play increase. But just right now, it seems to me that the game is probably in one of the best states of balance it's ever been. I actually really like the way that it seems to me they're, besides maybe a few Dark Elder codexes, they're really shifting away from super strong characters and leaning into things like core units. Like the units are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and characters have really become more of buffers, more of individual, very precision tools versus the kind of like army winning things that they were before, where you built around the characters. Now it's like it's the opposite. You build around the units, and the characters are there to support. So I like that direction that they're going, and I'm hoping that we continue to see that in the new books. I have some concerns, obviously, around secondaries, faction secondaries, and obviously
secondaries are a concern.
The power creep's a little bit of a concern, but again, I'm hoping we'll see a chapter approved sometime this summer, and hopefully that comes with a whole set of missions that maybe helps or hurts certain armies as well.
Yep. I think secondaries are my biggest concern right now. More than anything, it's codex secondaries. I would love a chapter approved that just gives everybody a bunch, so that we at least have those.
Yeah.
If everybody had them, then we could say everyone was on the same page that way, and then work to just fix the ones that are just too easy, right? And make things better that way. But that's my biggest concern. That's where I could see like comfortable with. Like if I went to an event and they said no army secondaries, I'd say okay, that's fine. I'm not gonna raise this up any ladders or anything. I'm not gonna set my pants on fire, rip my shirt off in anguish.
Have you ever done that? Ripped your shirt off in anguish?
Oh yeah, several times. Usually it wasn't in anguish. It was for money, but
I'm sure we could talk a big topic, whole show about this, but do you think it's healthy right now for the game that everyone is playing the same missions? Like, do you think that's a thing that, because in a sense it is its own form of comp, in the sense where it's a lot of people are saying that the mission set is solved right now, that we need new missions or updated secondaries. Like there's maybe a half dozen secondaries that are taken fairly often, and then the rest are basically all in the bin. So do you think it's a good thing? Because I actually, as a player, I actually don't enjoy it as much. The fact that I can't go to maybe 3 or 4 events and play like Nova. Like I like the fact that there was a little bit of, there's Maelstrom thrown in sometimes. There was ITC thrown in. There was Nova. On the flip side, I've been to some events where the TOs wrote missions and they're absolutely awful, and I was just like, can you guys just play ITC? So
they were garbage.
So there's both sides of that spectrum. But do you think that's something that's like a good for the game and healthy for the game overall, or do you think it leads to stagnation in a lot of ways?
I was always for there being like multiple ways to play the game. Something I espoused quite a bit in 8th edition was I really wanted there to be some kind of like semi-professional, whatever you want to call it, circuit that people basically got invited to based off of their performance, but that it wasn't just ITC, right? Like you would do 6 events that were ITC, 3 or 4 that were Nova, 2 that were Adepticon missions. Like get mission sets that were vetted and good, but like change it up every now and then, right? Like think about like NASCAR. Like not every event, maybe that's changed. I haven't watched NASCAR in 25 years, but they used to do like road races versus circle, and that completely changed how you play, how you raced. Like that's something that I would have kind of loved to have seen, is like, here's a different way to do it. And I am kind of hopeful that we'll get a chapter approved set of missions that are like very different than what we're currently playing, so that we can have that. I know that people are playtesting Maelstrom already, and I would love to see how good that is and how much it changes the game by having it, because I would love for that to be a thing. Like here's a Maelstrom event that's big, here's a regular like Eternal War, etc. Right. I mean, I'd be so into that. I want there to be different. I want there to be things that are out of the ordinary, so it doesn't become solved so quickly.
Whatever, I did remember seeing the rules that they did release Maelstrom missions. Whatever happened, did those kind of get basically ignored? No one ended up ever really adopting that? Because I know the WTC was famous for the fact that they ran Maelstrom plus 17 other rules on top, but at the core they played Maelstrom. That was like the core of the WTC. So did those rules get released, or is that something that they were just teasing? I feel like it just kind of was forgotten.
I'm not sure if the full thing was ever released. Maybe it wasn't a white. They released a little bit of it, but I know like there were people. I know for a fact people were playtesting Maelstrom missions for 9th edition very recently.
Right.
And I haven't heard much since. Like I talked to a couple of the people testing them, and they were like they're fun. But that was all I got out of them, because like I said, I don't try to pry if I know that you do that kind of thing. But like that's something I would love to see. Is like a secondary way to play the game. Maybe that'll be the next chapter approved, and I'm all for it if it is. If they created like 6 or 7 extra missions that play completely different to what we currently play, I'm balls deep into it. Love it.
Yeah, I to your point about like the kind of multiple leagues, one actually upcoming topic is going to be whether we should be adopting like Elo ratings in 40K, competitive 40K. So rather than having kind of like ITC scores, which is kind of a bit of an archaic system, I think, is whether Elo ratings is something that, and for those of you who don't know, Elo ratings is kind of what they use in chess, where each player gets a rating. You know, a Grandmaster might be like 2400, and then you basically get points for playing players that are better than you. And why I bring it up at all is because with the coronavirus pandemic and the fear of doing very large events, the future of 40K could be lots of small events with just good players. And that's where an Elo system actually really shines, is that you don't need, the size of the event actually has no bearing on your ability to move up the rankings, right? It's really about who you play and whether you're good enough. And so, and it's not this like, you know, anyways, it's gonna be a future episode about it. I'm trying to find someone that's actually like knows more about it than I do, but
it's a great topic. Like Steve Pamprine has like waxed poetic about it multiple times. I think he'd be a great guest. I know like the Goonhammer guys have been using a Glico system, which is another ELO rating system for factions, and I've loved it. I've always had a problem with it on a player level because of how we currently play the game. It's very hard to get an accurate rating system outside of like a core group of people that play a ton. It ends up skewing at the lower ends, but like we mentioned earlier, with FLG creating this kind of like super major circuit, and with all these other events kind of coming up, I think it wouldn't be too difficult now to create a very viable ELO or Glico rating system for 40K.
Yeah, and I think
easy, and
I think so too. And it would be even better if Games Workshop could maintain it, and they had a website where you could log in and get stats and know how people are doing.
7. I agree, all of it.
Yeah. So, all right, Peter. That's it for the show. Is there anywhere online that people can find you, or do you want them to find you at all?
Yeah, I do 40kstats.com. You can always message me there if you're like, man, you did something wrong, because I love that, so that I can fix it. I try to update it every week. There's one event I'm missing right now. I cover all the GTs and majors there. I upload the top 4s. I do stats for all of the different factions there. I'm on the 40K Adjacent Show every Tuesday morning at like 4 in the morning my time with Rob Symes and Val Heffelfinger, where we try our best not to talk about Warhammer 40K. We generally succeed for about 45 minutes of the show. And it's like the best part of my life since COVID started. It's the only reason why I haven't been in like a complete depressive state, because it makes my week. Sometimes I'm on Chapter Tactics, sometimes I'm on other shows, but that's kind of where you find me right now.
That's awesome. And I do have one request, and this is something that I haven't been to 40K stats in a while because I haven't cared about 40K stats at all because there's been no events. But is it still the case that when you want to look at their most recent events, you have to scroll to the very bottom, or has that been fixed?
Oh, I fixed
Thank
that.
God.
I fixed that.
I used to go there and like, God damn, I gotta scroll through 40 pages of things to get to the bottom of the newest events.
Hey, I created a link where you could go to the latest week. But anyway, yeah, that was a problem with how I built the website because I'm not a good website designer. Right. So when 9th edition launched, I fixed it because then I could just delete all the events and restart.
That's awesome. All right, well, thanks everyone for listening. Just as a reminder, this episode will be available on podcast. Make sure to check us out on the podcast. Please make sure to like and subscribe and all that fun stuff if you enjoyed the episode. Leave some comments down below what you guys think. Should comp systems make a return, or should they burn in the 9 rings of hell? My name is Jim, and this is Peter. This has been Politics and Plastics, episode 2. Tune in next week for episode 3 with Val Heffelfinger. We're going to talk about esports and whether or not 40K should be one. And that's it. Have a good night.